All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm so glad you are here. The title for today, is Reimagining Assessment and Treatment Success, Exploring Therapeutic Relationships. This is now my third webinar, so I'm feeling comfortable now. And in this series, I just decided that I always like to start things with music, but I wanted to have a little theme. And so we are doing Afro beats as our playlist genre. And the first song that I selected had to do with, I made a connection to cultural humility, which was our first webinar. And then last webinar in November, we were talking about cultural responsiveness. And so I used the acronym ART, A-R-T, in the song Art by Tyla. I made that connection, and now it is the third webinar, and we are talking about one of the topics that is so near and dear to my heart, therapeutic relationships. And I want to give you some background on this song. So that song was called Piece of My Heart by Wizkid featuring Brent Faiyaz. And Wizkid is a Nigerian superstar and visionary behind Starboy Entertainment. And he recently, I believe this song is pretty new-ish. This song called Piece of My Heart, and it is a collaboration with Brent Faiyaz, who is American. And this song fuses Afro beats as well as R&B, two of my favorite genres blending together. And the song is essentially about love, giving someone a piece of your heart. But the themes in the song are vulnerability and emotional resonance. And that gives the fans a little glimpse of his album that will be coming out. But I thought vulnerability, emotional resonance, that goes so very closely with our topic for today, because building, repairing, and maintaining therapeutic relationships is a hard job. And therapeutic relationships, I would say, are the soul of your therapy. So today we are going to address therapeutic relationships as foundational to your assessment and treatment in speech language practices. I want to take a moment to just review this land acknowledgement and acknowledge the land that you may be on currently. I am located in Charlotte, North Carolina, and this is the land of the Cherokee, Kajwaba, Saponi, and Congaree peoples before colonization. So I'm hoping that we can all just take this moment to recognize the impact of colonization on their livelihood and the grave injustices inflicted on them. These topics are, I would say that therapeutic relationships and teacher-student relationships, that research is very similar. So anyone in education, I'm hoping, can get something from this presentation. So for my disclosures, I receive a salary as a visiting associate clinical professor at Northeastern University, Charlotte, and I'm also receiving an honorarium for this webinar. Non-financial, I am a board member of the National Black Association of Speech, Language, and Hearing, and a member of ASHA Special Interest Group 14. And I didn't put that, but I guess sort of related. My psychology background, I am also a member of the American Psychological Association. So, a little bit about me, just a little. I am from Savannah, Georgia, and I'm currently in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was a school-based SLP for 6.5 years. In fact, that was the only setting I worked in. So that is all my experience, all my SLP experience is in the schools. I love the schools, so I'm so glad to be here with you all again this evening. I've been in academia around 4.5 years now, which is crazy because it doesn't feel that long. Some of my subject matter research experience. Sorry for my typo there. My dissertation study was around therapeutic relationships. So I spent about 4 years studying this topic. So I have I've gleaned a lot of wisdom in my research journey. And then I recently had a publication earlier this fall, which is essentially my dissertation research, but a lot shorter. Took a 300-page dissertation and turned it into a 40-page article. It definitely worked up a sweat, but I'm going to share that with you all this evening. So in the spirit of self-reflexivity, I just want to begin with my positionality. I am a dark-skinned, Black American, cisgender, heterosexual Christian woman and descendant of enslaved African people. I have earned a doctorate degree. I am middle class. I do not have any visible disabilities. I am monolingual, bidialectal. I'm a speech language practitioner, psychologist, and professor. I am a daughter, a sister, a friend, and my core values are love, faith, hope, and justice. We have 3 objectives for this evening. And every webinar, I just talk and talk and talk, and then the time slips away. So please use the chat if you have any questions. If you want to talk further about something, please, you can even unmute if you would like to or feel comfortable, but whatever you would like to do, please make yourself at home. Our 3 objectives for this evening: define therapeutic relationships by describing the 3 elements of therapeutic working alliances. Next, we will explain how cultural humility facilitates therapeutic relationships. So just so you can know the connection to that. And then finally, list 5 practical strategies for prioritizing and cultivating therapeutic relationships in assessment and treatment. But I'm hoping that these can be applicable outside of SLP and outside of just assessment and treatment, but just in general. So I want to, for our flow for today, I will start like I always do with a grounding, just to have some mindfulness. I don't know where you're coming from. I don't know how your day was. I hope you're okay. But we are just going to ground in and get all on one accord. And then I'll go through the working definition of therapeutic relationships and talk about the connection with cultural humility, and then end with some strategies. So if you've never heard of the term grounding, it is a mindfulness exercise just to center our thoughts on the topic. So I want you to watch this really brief TikTok and then we'll have the questions.
I've got 1,000 more questions. They're pulling me out of here.
Please ask one more. Please ask one more. Please. Please, 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 please.
Can we please?
Please. Please. Please.
Now I'm nervous about my last question.
No.
Oh God,
The
make it
song
good.
that I'm most looking forward to in part 2 is For Good.
Ooh.
This idea of we may not be changed for the better, but this person has changed us for the rest of our lives. In what ways the person sitting next to you changed you for good?
Gosh,
Oh,
you
man.
are very good. You are very good.
Oh my gosh.
Well, yeah. I think we found a little piece of ourselves in each other. I think there are little pieces of us that when we got to do this together, when we first started, each of us was missing like a little chunk. And I think we've been able to see in each other a bit of a reflection. And so I think I've gotten a little bit of her softness, and she's got
Her strength.
a little bit of my strength.
Yeah. Truthfully, we're a bunch of crybabies over here.
Catch the latest on this story at Fox 32 on Fox Local.
Okay. Okay, so I don't know about any of you. Please give me an emoji or let me know in the chat. Wicked has had me in a chokehold for quite some time. And so I'm so excited that the movie has been released and that people are talking about it. And I have really enjoyed watching interviews with Cynthia and Ariana because you can tell that they seem to have a nice relationship. So any question will suffice, whatever you feel like maybe contributing to this conversation. But I want to know, based on this brief TikTok, could you describe the relationship between Ariana and Cynthia? Or maybe what are some themes if you had to give one word to describe their relationship, what would it be in the chat? Caring. I'm loving the vulnerability too. Some physical touch, they were holding hands. Um, they really care about each other, strong connection. Absolutely. You can tell just from that brief clip, right? Respect. Yeah. Yes, trust. So, hey, Shay. Yes. So, this is a very brief clip. And when I talk about therapeutic relationships, and even when I was studying it, I realized that many times we will say that this is a professional relationship or clinical relationships and things like that. But the underlying parts of relationships are the same. I mean, in any relationship, you have to have trust, you have to have care, respect. Those things go across many boundaries, no matter what that relationship looks like or where that relationship is. So, my next question for reflection as we ground in on this topic, if anyone feels comfortable maybe sharing how a client or a student or maybe even a colleague has changed you for good.
Hello everyone. My name is Yvette McCray. Hey, Dr. Scott.
Hey.
To answer the question, I feel like when working with autism clients, my autism patients, it taught me patience. And it also taught me, sometimes and it's more so catered to what do you want to do. So it's more so client led therapy and just patience raw and just knowing that it's always not gonna be activity one, activity two all day, every day.
Absolutely. It puts you in a vulnerable space to have plans, and then the environment and the situation and your client is like, no, not today. Sorry, plans, they're not happening. It takes a lot of, like you said, flexibility. You have to shift, you have to be able to read the room and attune to your client. And so that is something that is learned, but over time, it actually makes us better, I think, better therapists. So thank you for sharing.
I was gonna say flexibility too, but not just my like I guess I would say across the board flexibility with the parents, flexibility with like the general education teachers, I guess I would say. And then also like with the working with the student. Um sorry if you can hear the background. But I just feel like there are some strategies, or it's easy for me to say these are the strategies that work um when I'm in like a one-on-one session with a student, but then it's like that's not going to work in the classroom. So then trying to figure out and problem solve how I can support this, how I can provide supports to the student so that in a way that the teacher can also do it so that we can generalize the skills that we are doing
Mhm.
sessions. And then flexibility with the parent because like the same reason. And then with the student too, just because they're the ones that are leading the session. And so yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is what makes you a good therapist, being able to be humble and just say, look, I don't have all the answers. In fact, I know what works here, but I don't know what works there, and I have to collaborate and I have to, set my alleged expertise down sometimes and communicate with others to make plans. Sarah said working with kids with AAC. Oh, yes. Oh, filling in the quiet spaces. That really changed it. I think learning how to sit with silence and not feeling like you have to hear if you're in a session, you need to hear your voice or something is going wrong, and just allowing those quiet spaces, because when that happens, you never know what can be communicated and what might want to be communicated if maybe you slow down. And I know that made me very uncomfortable, especially when I first started working with clients who were not speaking, and just feeling like, whoa, it's quiet. Let me just play some music. Or I would over talk and not just be with them and realize that we were communicating without words, because obviously communication is not just speaking. So I love that. Very good point. Well, thank you all for sharing. So we're gonna get right into it when it comes to what exactly is a therapeutic relationship. And some of the words that you all said, like flexibility and listening, or active listening, and not filling in quiet spaces. I like to say, like, just holding the space. All of those things are incredible skills that you will need to build, repair, and maintain. And I don't just say build anymore, because I don't want you to get the impression that you build a therapeutic relationship and that's it. Like any other relationship, you build it as you go. It is a steady, slow process. Sometimes something happens and you have to repair it, and then you want to maintain it. So there's a lot of work involved in a rhythm and a flow that you have to get into when it comes to building the relationship. So, if you have never heard of this terminology, Sigmund Freud, who is the father of psychoanalysis, in 1912 described positive transference as admissible to consciousness and unobjectable in the vehicle of success in psychoanalysis, exactly as it is in other methods of treatment. And he highlighted this predicament where patients at the beginning of their therapy, obviously he's talking about psychotherapy, and y'all, this was like way before humanism. So, but at the beginning of therapy, when they felt challenged and they felt uncomfortable, but they were still eager to improve. So he was really just describing, what is this thing that keeps them going, even though this is hard, even though they have to be really vulnerable, even though they are uncomfortable. And he talked about, if the client and the clinician establish a trustworthy and comforting relationship, then the client will stay in therapy despite their increasing levels of anxiety. Again, this is 1912. And he also talked about the importance of the patient's conscious attitudes, such as like, hey, I'm here. Do I want to do this? Yes or no? But then also the unconscious things. So Freud was also known for talking about things like projecting and transference and the things you don't know you're doing. But that is really the origin. Psychoanalytic theory is really the origin of this idea of the therapeutic relationship. And then I want to say that there are many different terms. I just landed on therapeutic relationship because I felt like that was the most umbrella term. But you might hear working alliance or therapeutic working alliance. There's also research that talks about the real relationship. But basically, we are talking about the same thing. And the operational definition for therapeutic alliance. So Edward Bourdin, he was the first to operationally define this working alliance. And it is really an extension of what Freud was talking about in the early 1900s around patients' attachment to the therapist and or the therapy process. So acknowledging this bond with the therapist, but then how do you continue with the process of therapy? And so he proposed he said, I propose that the working alliance between the person who seeks change and the one who offers to be a change agent is one of the keys, if not the key, to the change process. So not only did Borden operationally define therapeutic relationships, but he said that this is foundational to success in treatment or change. So, what are the three elements of the therapeutic working alliance or therapeutic relationship? Agreement on the goals of therapy, an assignment of tasks or a series of tasks, and the development of bonds. So I want you to remember those three elements: goals, task, bonds. Goals, we kind of know what that is. Task, I expanded tasks to also include activities, materials that you use, and then bonds. A lot of times we use the word rapport to talk about the emotional bond. So let's get into each one. What about the goals? So no change goals can be reached without some basic level of understanding and agreement between the principles involved, and the movement towards this goal is going to depend on how vividly the therapist can link the goals to the task that the client is essentially working on, and the things, the difficulties they have and the things they're trying to change. So also, the depth of your emotional bond depends on the task and the readiness of the client. So there's research on like zone of proximal development and having someone be ready for whatever you're doing. But you want readiness is also dependent on personal characteristics, but also the environment, things outside of the person, like supports they may have, supports they don't have. And so you want to think about those things when it comes to goals. So some tips I have for when it comes to agreement on goals, or getting to that place of agreement on goals, which is the first element of the therapeutic relationship. Collaborate on your goals and focus on sharing the experience, not just meeting the goal. I like to say focus on the journey and not just the destination. So everything isn't about 80%, 90%, 3 out of 5, but the experience of getting to that goal is just as important. Also, you want to make your goals meaningful to the client and the family, not just meaningful to you, not just, well, they need to know this for literacy and further development, but it needs to be meaningful or they won't be able to persist through the challenges because they don't have that buy-in. Agreement is a prerequisite. So if you are running into an instance where, oh, I don't want to do this therapy, I don't believe in this, well, then there is probably not agreement on the goal. And that is very important. So you want to have agreement on what you are doing in therapy. What are your intentions? Why am I here? Also, you can deepen your rapport with representative activities and materials to meet the goals. You want to attune yourself to the client's capacity, motivation, and lived experience. So, knowing when today they don't have it. I like to use different metaphors, like maybe, how is your battery for today? Or what are some things we do when we're on a low battery mode? We still showed up. We can't go full speed ahead. So talking about capacity openly, talking about motivation, what is motivating, what is not, and then thinking about their lived experience, because that is going to relate to the extent to which that goal is meaningful to them. And then you want to be proactive when you're setting goals, especially when you have maybe even you wanted to set a goal that is super measurable. You could accomplish it in your 1 year for your IEP, but maybe the client or the family really wants something that is far down the line. So you compromise on this goal. So it is going to be a push for the client. You want to be proactive in preparing for frustration, decreased motivation on this journey. So I like to use things before you even start therapy to be your foundation for when things get hard. Maybe using books to teach your younger clients about growth mindset and everything. You get better with effort and keep trying. Things like resilience. Also, I love setting agreements before when you start your therapy. So there's a book called The Four Agreements. I love it. I read it my first time I was in mental health therapy. It really helped me change my life, I would say. One of the agreements is not to take things personally. Another agreement, compliments or negative things. And then another agreement is do your best, nothing more, nothing less. And I think that one is very relatable to the work that we do. So when it comes to the task of therapy, it has to be a clear mutual understanding by the client. So the strength of your therapeutic working alliance depends on that mutual understanding where the participants or the clients know that their task is going to lead to them accomplishing the goal. They cannot just not see the connection. And with kids, this happens often where you might say, what are you doing in speech? And they say something, but they have no idea what they're working on. We play games. And while it is wonderful to disguise the work of therapy, that is not a way for them to take ownership. So taking ownership of this is why I'm doing this task because it helps me get to my ultimate goal is going to be important. Also thinking about the demands of the task and then the person's fit. So starting on a task, what is that going to take for them? Also designating the task of therapy. There are many different ways to do that. All the tasks don't have to be clinician led. So you can have some variety in that. And then empathetic understanding, communicating, interpreting what you are doing. So really being clear, self-disclosure, to give examples of a time where maybe you did something similar or you had to do something similar in your life can be really helpful. So I want to give some practical tips for coming up with your agreement around tasks. Your clients need to understand the tasks, the activities, and the materials. Why are we using this visual aid? Why did we do this activity? Also, providing materials in the client's native language is critical. You want to, that is like a bare minimum thing that you want to do. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Explaining terminology. One of the ways that we hoard power is that we don't explain what we're doing. We have a lot of terms that no one knows. In fact, some of us don't know the terms that we talk about all the time. So we need to be a lot more clear when it comes to our terminology because it can be very, very technical. Your clients should take ownership of their goals. They should see that connection between what they're doing. Also, when it comes to your materials, you want to have variety. You want to base your activities and your materials on the client's interests, their lived experiences, and also you want to make it functional, something they can use in their real life. And be open to their ideas and create space for innovation and autonomy when it comes to the task. So maybe thinking of ways, there's one activity where they're going to need a lot of help, but maybe there's another activity that they could do completely on their own, or they can take the lead, or they can help someone else, and that'll increase that buy-in. So the last and my favorite element I must add of the therapeutic relationship is going to be the emotional bond. And this is the nature of the human relationship between the therapist and the patient or client or student. So you have to have some basic level of trust for any relationships. And we don't talk about this enough, y'all, but your client liking you is actually important. I know, I know. Your client needs to like you and you need to like them. They know when you don't like them. So liking, caring, trusting, those things are incredibly important and things that we just don't talk about enough. There are also public and private dimensions of the relationship. So thinking about when it comes to self-disclosure, thinking about what you disclose and have that being very directly related to the type of relationship you have with them or the amount of trust and rapport that has been built. And some practical tips. Be intentional to reflect and measure the relationship between you and your clients. Be aware of your blind spots and don't make assumptions. Also, you want to prioritize building trust. How do we build trust? Effective communication, transparency, consistency, vulnerability, unconditional positive regard. If you don't know what that is no matter what they do, they are a person that I view positively. I don't change my view of them because of something that they do. It is unconditional. Healthy boundaries, empathy, and responsiveness. Learn your clients' love languages. Love languages can go a long way, especially if you are feeling challenged with just like building that trust and maybe that initial liking, trying to speak their language and see what they like, see what they respond to most. I think a lot of times we use a lot of verbal praise, but maybe everyone doesn't respond to that. Now, I'm not saying go buy your clients gifts, but maybe gifts, you can interpret that as external reinforcement until you develop your relationship. Um, Lean into discomfort and take advantage of cultural opportunities when they come up. So when someone is sharing and really initiating this bond, don't lean out, lean in. Then you also want to learn about and develop trauma responsiveness so you can foster safe, we can't guarantee safety, but you want to try your best to foster safe emotional bonds and lean into cultural humility so you can heal from historic and generational mistrust, because many people that we work with have a very good reason not to trust us. People with disabilities, because of the ableism that is deeply rooted in our profession, have every right not to trust us. People of color have every right not to trust us. I could go on and on. So we don't want to rush past mistrust. We want to learn and we want to recognize it. The therapeutic relationship is incredibly significant in many fields, whether it's medicine, counseling, psychology, OT, even SOP. The research says one thing very clearly, that this relationship positively influences your treatment outcomes. So I talked about this just a little in our last webinar, but I want to reiterate that the therapeutic relationship is not just something to think about. Well, I think they like me. I think it's going well. Ask, measure it. You are going to seek feedback. You are going to humble yourself to get comfortable receiving feedback, not just from your clients, but your families that you're working with, community members, maybe the entity you are a part of. So quantitative ways you can collect data or measure your therapeutic relationships can be with surveys or rating scales. Qualitative, you might want to do very short, you don't have to, it's not a research study, y'all, but an interview or open-ended surveys. Less structured, have a conversation. How did that feel for you? How did that go for you? What do you think about these materials? You can do that after every activity. Read the room. Check the vibes. If the vibes are off, the vibes are off. Have the humility to assess your limits and say, you know what? They don't like me. This isn't going well. Assess your limits, keep learning, but lean into that and be flexible, making changes when you receive feedback. So now I am going to very briefly, I have provided an article going over the connection between culture, humility, and therapeutic relationships in my research. But before we do that, I want to give a quick little review from the last two webinars. So I talked about this journey to culture, humility, how culturally responsive and culturally sustaining practices are important. And then you have culture humility that has a gateway to social justice and therefore liberation. If you are not familiar with cultural responsiveness, if you maybe weren't at the previous webinars, I'll give you a definition really quick. Culturally responsive teaching is an approach that challenges educators to recognize that rather than deficits, students bring strengths into the classroom that should be leveraged to make learning experiences relevant for them. And in the first webinar, I gave the 4 pillars of cultural humility that I want to go over again, just to get back into, just in case you forgot some of this terminology or didn't know it to start with, that's totally fine. Cultural humility is a lifelong process of reflecting on your biases, your privilege, and your identities. It is also redressing power imbalances that are inherent in our client-clinician relationships and developing mutually beneficial partnerships with communities. And finally, seeking institutional accountability. So to what extent is the institution I am a part of helping me or hindering me from enacting the principles of social justice? So I have provided this article to you in a Google folder. You can find the article as well as a bright pink visual aid. And I'm just going to go through this a little bit and so you can have an idea of what is the connection between cultural humility and therapeutic relationships. And my article is called Keeping It Real with Relationships, Cultural Humility, and Therapeutic Relationships with Culturally and Linguistically Diverse Students. So in my study, I had the pleasure of interviewing 17 school-based SLPs, and it turned out that the recruitment group I used this was during COVID, so my original recruitment idea did not work, but I found an online group, and it actually was a group for racially and ethnically minoritized SLPs. So it turned out that the speech language pathologists that I interviewed, all of them but one were women of color. And out of the 17 interviews that I did, one of them didn't really talk too much about school. So I ended up with 16. And the themes that came from these interviews, we also did focus groups to check the extent to which they agreed with the findings of the interviews. But some of the themes that emerged was that they have very strong relationships with their therapeutic relationships with their culturally and linguistically diverse students. They also noted valuable personality traits such as openness, being caring, and being patient as essential for these relationships. And the best finding was that in order to build the relationships, you must have 2 magic ingredients. And those ingredients are cultural humility and rapport. And on the opposite end, if you are not enacting cultural humility and you don't build rapport, that is going to be detrimental to building relationships with culturally and linguistically diverse students. So that's what the study found. It was a wonderful time. And I want to go over this visual. Before I do that, when it comes to therapeutic relationships and cultural humility, it's not that if I have cultural humility and if I do these things and check this off, I'm not going to have any problems. You are going to have cultural missteps. That is going to happen no matter how hard you try. We all have unconscious biases that cannot be avoided. But when you enact cultural humility, when you are committed to lifelong learning and orienting yourself to your client and building rapport, you can usually recover from those missteps because you build the rapport. Another way I can say that is when you have built a relationship with someone, sometimes they give you the benefit of the doubt when they know you, they know your intentions, and you have at least tried. So with this visual, I know it is small on the screen, but hopefully you can see it if you click on it. What I wanted to leave readers with is some questions to ponder when it comes to your therapeutic relationships in enacting cultural humility. So I color coded this. In yellow, you have questions around critical self-reflection. So thinking about your identities and who you are, your positionality biases. So reflecting on questions like, what are the similarities and differences between you and your student in terms of identities being marginalized and privileged? Another question, have you explored your own personality traits, attachment style, core beliefs, and other means to self-exploration as a way of evaluating and developing your therapist's disposition? Love that question. I made it up, so that's why I love it. But I think this is something we don't think about enough. So really, we don't talk about personality, but you know how sometimes you don't mesh well with someone? Maybe it's a personality difference. And hey, we're all human. So, have you ever done a personality test? Do you really know your personality? Do you know your attachment style? I'm anxious avoidant, but I'm recovering. Okay. That has an impact on every relationship that I have. What are your core beliefs about yourself? So, self exploration is going to be foundational for critical self reflection, which is an aspect of cultural humility. Um, the blue is going to be a question around lifelong learning. So, how can you engage in ongoing professional development or learning communities to facilitate lifelong learning around social justice, inequity, implicit biases, and privilege? I always say the best thing you can do is to acknowledge your blind spots and go seek learning in that area. So for me, one of my areas of privilege is that I am a cisgender heterosexual person. So my blind spot is going to be anyone experiences of the LGBTQIA community. So that is always going to be an area that I need to do some learning, some reflection, some bias checking. And so I'm going to make sure that is a part of my professional development plan. It doesn't have to be formal professional development. Sometimes learning happens best in relationships or in learning communities. The green is going to be about cultural humility and collaborating. So these are very specific to in therapy things that you can do. How can you include, honor, and embrace your students' home culture and heritage language in the development of their therapy goals? And how can you do those things in the development of their therapy task? In the purple, no, I'm going to do orange first. Orange has to do with building mutually beneficial partnerships. So thinking about rapport, but not just with your individual clients, but also families, communities, macro level. So have you considered systemic influences on rapport building, such as generational mistrust or generational trauma, racism, ableism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, linguicism? Have you considered that impact on the way that you are building rapport with your clients, given your identities and theirs? What are some ways you can intentionally build mutually beneficial partnerships with your students, their families, their communities outside of therapy? Do you shop at the same grocery store that they shop at? Do you know the issues of that community? Do you know the history of that community? Is there redlining in that community? So you want to know about communities because that is going to impact your ability to build relationships. And another reflection question, how can you implement mechanisms like surveys, rating scales, discussions to collect feedback from your clients, your parents, about their perception of the therapeutic relationship? So finally, in purple, that last element of cultural humility is going to be institutional accountability. These are two questions you can reflect on for that area. How can you enact cultural humility by working on an institutional level to ensure that systems and entities you are a part of move toward inclusion and equity for their client, for the family, and for their community? And the last question, how can you enact cultural humility on an institutional level to ensure that the systems that you are a part of engage in assessment and treatment practices that are not biased? So what are you doing with your privilege and your platform?
I like the idea of this is Sarah. I like the idea of thinking about the history of the community and the area that your students might be living in. Thought that was an interesting point.
I never thought about that until I moved to Houston and the community, the first school district that I worked in, I wouldn't say that I learned much about the community. I did not. I didn't even know about any of this. But the second community, there was something about the community that was very rich and I was intrigued. And then when I became intrigued and curious and learned about it, I was like, oh my gosh, how could I think that this is not important? Like the way that I interacted with parents changed. I just knew things about it was like I could see maybe relationships or lacking of relationships with certain members of the community and wondering like what is this all about, what happened here, this type of thing. And so it is so important because when you're building trust and rebuilding from mistrust, it cannot be done on an individual client level. It has to be done more at a macro level. So getting to know your community, maybe even if you don't live in the community where you work, maybe saying, I'm going to get my car washed in this community. I'm going to go to the grocery store here, even though I don't live over here, just to be more involved. Yeah.
There's also a comment in the chat.
Woo. Yeah, it's making me think about interactions, relationships with neurodiverse students, one in particular where I could have done a better job at building relationship to facilitate learning. Hey, we all could have done a better job, right? So give yourself grace, but the reflection that you are doing is going to make you better the next time around. And I always say when you work with one person that's neurodiverse, you have only worked with one person. So whatever you learn from that one person, developing that ability to, hey, let me reflect on this. I want to do this differently next time. And prioritizing those relationships, especially with your clients who have these marginalities, because there's so much stigma around neurodiversity. So thank you for being vulnerable and sharing, Nicole. So we're going to work it now. We are going to work it, work it, work it. Unless you work your relationships, you won't have any. And if you don't work on your therapeutic relationships, I mean, you'll have them. They just won't be good. Okay. You want them to be good. You want them to be strong. You got to be intentional. So I'm going to talk about some things sorry, I skipped a slide, some things you can do in assessment and some things you can do in treatment. But generally, these are just things to think about. I'm going to go pretty fast because we only have about 8 minutes left. But all of these, I am like bare bones giving you information. Every one of these points can be addressed a lot further. So the first thing you can do to build and prioritize your therapeutic relationships within assessment is going to be conducting ethnographic interviews. I talked a little bit about this last webinar when I talked about cultural responsiveness, but it is critical before you assess someone and get all in their business and ask them to be vulnerable. You need to build some sort of relationship. So building that rapport prior to assessment. This is most important for your client, for all clients, but especially your clients with marginalized identities because of the mistrust. In our field, if you think about the history of speech language pathology, the history of education, the history of the medical system, it is testing people, using results to push narratives. So we have to think about that historical place and build rapport first. That is one way to right that wrong. There's an article that talks about by Jenkins and Rojas that talks about ethnographic interviewing. And if you type in, hey, give me an ethnographic interview for SLP, you won't find one because it is not a thing. It is something iterative that you create. And essentially, it is all about the way you ask questions. It is about asking open-ended questions instead of giving someone a quick survey and they only tell you what you want to know. This is about them telling you what they want you to know. So you start with descriptive questions and then you narrow it down into structural questions. I have a picture here about using culturally responsive approaches. So this is an example of yarning, and this is from Aboriginal communities. And this is a way of doing interviewing that is very much culturally responsive. So I hope you can just like look it up after this. It's super cool. Also using the funds of knowledge framework. So just acknowledging that your families, your clients are coming in with assets. They are already doing things before they met you. So you are trying to get to know, what are you already doing? What works for you already? What does it look like a day in the life? And not just asking questions about what they have problems with or their disability. Who are you? Oh, you're married. How's that been? Really starting broad. Um, then the next assessment strategy is going to be culturally responsive least bias assessment. I talked far more about this in the last webinar, but just some quick tips. You absolutely need to learn the history of our field and the history of standardized assessments, because the foundations of standardized assessments are not pretty, y'all. Okay. And we need to know that so that we can really uproot many of the things that we are continuing to do. Also, understanding the systemic implications of biased assessments. So what does it mean for you to test this young Black man that is an African American English speaker, and then you put him in speech, and really he doesn't have a disability, but he is correctly speaking the language of his community. And then before you know it, now this happens and this happens. And what's the implication of that? So thinking about that from a systemic level. Dynamic assessment, prioritizing that test, teach, retest model when you are doing assessments rather than just using standardized assessments in comparison. Also, if you have to use standardized assessments, you can modify them or not report the scores and use them as a tool when your clients aren't represented in the norming sample. You can create your own assessments to highlight strengths if you realize assessments that you have aren't really highlighting strengths. The last three tips I have are going to be for your intervention. The first I have already kind of mentioned, but collaborative, mutually beneficial goal setting. My biggest tip here is don't do the thing that we were taught to do, which is do the assessment. These are the areas of weakness, so that means these are the goals. No, it doesn't. It means that's an idea about the goals, but that's all I got. So when you identify the areas of weakness from your assessment, or you perceived it as a weakness, you are going to explore disconnects between that assessment and those evaluation results in the client, because maybe they don't perceive that to be their areas. Maybe there are bigger fish to fry in their life that they would want to work on. So we can't just choose goals for someone based on assessment results. Then really explore your client, your family, even your community views of success and progress, because largely socioeconomic status, cultural differences, there are going to be different ideas of what that looks like, and you want to be open. The other one that has to do with intervention is going to be your materials. You want to use inclusive materials. You want to use materials that center the heritage language, even if you don't speak it. So you are honoring this idea of translanguaging. You can even utilize your families and your communities to help you build materials and pick the target words that you want to use, and allow for your clients to speak in whatever language they choose to show their knowledge, and to use high quality materials like inclusive literature. Here is a checklist for identifying LGBTQIA children's literature and the quality of that literature. And that's by Dr. Jay Jenkins. And you can follow her on Instagram. She's awesome. And finally, when it comes to building your emotional bond, we got to heal, y'all. There's a lot of healing that we can do outside of our client that could benefit our client. These are my favorite books that I like to recommend to other people if you are starting your healing journey. The Racial Healing Handbook, My Grandmother's Hands, The Body Keeps the Score. But when you heal, it will heal your therapeutic relationships because that healing pours out. So if you know you have some areas, go ahead and do that work outside of therapy so that it can be a part of the work that you do. And so again, I took the whole time and tried my best to get through that. Please review this again if you can. I know I went so fast, but I just wanted to give you as much information as possible. Here are some of my references there. And then here is my information.
I guess my question is, I work with 3 to 5 year olds, and a lot of the time, the thing that the parent, like a lot of my kids are like not yet using words, I guess I would say. And so their parents are like their first and foremost concern is always, I just want my child to talk, whatever that looks like.
Mhm.
So, I guess for me, um, so I feel like in the past year or two, I have learned how to talk to parents about like AAC. And so then just like them accepting all forms of communication for their kids, and
Mhm.
also getting them to or encouraging them to like use like communication, getting them to use communication books or French vocabulary. But I guess um the part that is challenging is like whenever like I ask questions and um I at least sometimes I feel like they're getting a little bit frustrated with me because they're like, I said it's like I just want them to talk, or I said, and it's like I'm just trying to get a little bit more information so that I can figure out how to move.
I think that the discomfort is that is how it's going to be. And being able to hold that space because in reality, their response is based on where their heart is and where they are at that time. I mean, how many times have we worked with someone and like they were frustrated and you didn't get that far, but then over time, like years, they opened up to this process. And so I would just say, you can keep doing what you're doing because you're not doing anything wrong, showing them that what you're doing actually is working and benefiting, but then also holding that space for them because a lot of times this is very hard for parents to when they just want their kid to talk and they're not. And that's all they want to hear. They want to hear how many words did they say today? That's it. And so holding space for that because they are on a journey themselves.
It did help because helping them through the journey of their child not speaking right now or not communicating right now, and just yeah, just trying to navigate that. I know
Changing the language you're using too. I've lately been saying things like journey. Thank you for coming on this journey with us this semester, because maybe taking the shift off of I want this end goal to this is a process. And on this process, this is what we're doing. And they're doing a great job on this process. Let's lean into this process.
A colleague also talked about inch stones instead of milestones because there's, sometimes you have to really say like, look, this is another little inch stone we got when those milestones can be hard to.
Oh, why have I never heard that before? I am taking that. I love that. Follow me on Instagram or send me an email. I know I talk so fast, but I hope you got something out of this that you can take with you into your practice. You are very welcome.